what do you believe the federal government can do to protect our elections and reduce voter suppression?
We have to do this. I started an organization, Democracy Entrepreneurs, to support young people and others who are actually starting new organizations to promote our democracy. MA-04, who runs the New Georgia Project, who started it with Stacey Abrams as part of our group. I know this issue well. Voter suppression is real. We need a 21st Century Voting Rights Act that outlaws voter suppression. We need to make sure that everybody can have access to vote. We need to make sure that people can vote by mail, especially in this election. We need to fund that. We need to have penalties if people are engaging in voter suppression tactics. We need to put more money in for protection so that if an issue comes up, we can file the suits. But the main thing is to make sure that we have that 21st Century Voting Rights Act so that if there is a violation, the federal government can step in. That's key. We have to guarantee the right to vote for everyone. It's foundational if our democracy is going to be true to itself.
There's a lot that has to be done to reduce interference in elections and to stop voter suppression. And it's not only that it's a technical fix, it's also a necessary fix to protect our democracy. So the types of steps that can be taken include ensuring that voters, for example, now during COVID, have options to not have to risk their lives or their health by showing up at the polls. So providing more options, mail-in options for voters is one way. In terms of foreign influence, making sure that this is being tracked, investigated, that we send a clear message that this won't be allowed. And again, having worked at the United Nations and having worked with countries coming out of conflict, places like Somalia, where candidates fear, female candidates are harassed. We need to protect the entire institution and recognize that elections are about our democracy. Protecting them is critical to the future, and it's not simply technical disagreement. This shouldn't be an issue. Everybody should be getting behind this.
A lot. And there's short-term stuff we have to do in the midst of this crisis, and then there's long-term stuff that is vitally, vitally important, particularly in the wake of the 2013 Supreme Court ruling around the Voting Rights Act. So in the short term, we have to make sure that it is literally safe for people to go out and vote. We've been making the case for vote by mail for weeks now. It is absolutely essential that voters in Massachusetts and around the country be able to vote by mail. I think that any registered voter should simply have a ballot mailed to them, right? And be able to vote by mail without having to make a special request. States that already have vote by mail laws should expand them, and states like Massachusetts that don't have it at all need to get on the ball and make that happen. I also think we need to do away with voter ID laws. We need to remove witness requirements, and we need same-day and online registration. And we know that there are so many other tactics, largely used by Republicans to suppress the vote around running out of ballots or closing polling places and precincts where voters are largely Democratic. And we know that that means they're usually voters from communities of color. This is work that has been systemic and intentional coming out of the Republican Party for decades. It has grown exponentially since that 2013 Supreme Court ruling. And I fear that they are going to use this crisis, this COVID-19 crisis, to further their efforts to suppress the vote. And it's why we need things like vote by mail as soon as possible.
Well, unfortunately, the Republicans have figured out a really effective electoral strategy, which is to not let people vote. It works in almost every state and in almost every election. And it's insidious because it threatens the very fabric of our democracy and of our social contract. I'm a believer in universal vote by mail. We've seen states like Oregon make that effective. Whether or not Massachusetts can get that all the way across the finish line by the primary on September 1st, I do think that this pandemic should be a catalyst for us to do universal vote by mail and automatic same-day voter registration here in the Commonwealth. Those are pieces of legislation that are frankly past overdue and that extend the franchise to historically disenfranchised communities.
Well, we should reinstate the Justice Department's division that, I'm forgetting what this was. We need to reinstate the division that basically protects voters' rights, that was undone a few years ago?
I love this question because one, we saw what happens when you don't do anything. There's a lot of things that we need to deal with here. First of all, we need to not disenfranchise those voters who have been disenfranchised in the past. Like, we need to be promoting our election. We need to decrease all barriers to early elections and early voting. We need to get rid of the voting purging rolls that we're seeing. We need to get rid of partisan gerrymandering. We need to make sure that we have that everyone is signed up to be able to vote at the age of 18. And I do think at one point we can move that down to 16, but we need automatic voter registration. And we need to stop adding additional rules that affect people with voter ID laws. That is disenfranchising. At the same time, we need to increase the amount of money we're putting towards election security, because we've already been played with before and it will happen again. Finally, in regards to this election in particular, our primary September 1st and the presidential in November, we need to make sure we have voting by mail as one of the main options, right? It can't be only by itself. We need voting by mail, early voting, and you still need to have in-person voting because there are so many people, especially lower income and communities of color that move around that may not get a ballot in the mail, and they need the opportunity to go and fill that out. Same with those with disabilities. So we need to attack all three of those things at once.
So those are a little bit of really two issues that in some ways are connected, but in many ways are separate. So again, as a cybersecurity professional, I know that the best security is a combination of preventative, detective, and a responsive action. And one of the best things that we can do to protect our elections from external interference and cyber interference is actually to make sure that we have multiple ways of understanding the vote. We do this when we log on to accounts, and sometimes you get a text code from the company that you're logging into your account. That's called two-factor authentication. Well, we need two factors. So having a paper trail as well as an electronic trail is increasingly important. And that may sound strange coming from a technology person, that it shouldn't be all technology. But the safest way for us to have an election that is true and accurate and valid is to make sure that we have both a paper and electronic trail. In terms of voter suppression, that's a much more difficult issue. So many people have a hard time accessing our democracy in so many different ways. And I am fully in favor of making it as easy as possible for our citizens to vote. I do not agree with the positioning of the Republican Party that there's massive voter fraud. The data does not show that. The data shows that there's very little voter fraud, and that, in fact, many of the laws that are in place in different states, all they do is reduce the number of valid votes, not increase them. And they do it in a way that, whether it's intended or not, targets particular parts of our population. So I'm a big believer that we should increase the ability to access through vote by mail, through absentee balloting, for early balloting. And unfortunately, it's a challenge for the federal government. Congress can only do so much, but we should certainly pass laws that continue to protect the rights of people to vote. And by the way, I would finally add, I think that it's important to look at how the voting opportunities are actually spread geographically, because far too often we hear the stories of lower income areas where there are a high percentage of people of color having to wait in lines for hours to vote. And that is because there just aren't enough polling places. And that should be addressed as well.
I laugh only because for a president who I thought no longer had the capacity to shock me, Some of the president's tweets on this topic have been just stunning. I mean, look, Stacey Abrams should be the governor of Georgia right now, today. Why isn't she? Well, she's not the governor of Georgia because of voter suppression in African American communities, exactly as you indicate, because her opponent was the Republican Secretary of State. So I've got 2 points on this. The first is we need to protect our democracy. And I mean that about right now, but also about decades of attempts to undermine democracy, to suppress the vote, and to prevent communities of color and immigrants and young people from voting. So, we need to end partisan gerrymandering. We need to enact vote by mail, both for the September 1st primary here in Massachusetts and for the November elections, general elections, mailing every single registered voter a ballot. We need to expand registration deadlines. We need to expand early voting options. We need to make sure that poll workers have the protective equipment that they need so that we don't see a repeat of what happened in Wisconsin, where people were asked to choose between their safety and their participation in democracy, which was outrageous. We need to get dark money out of politics and overturn Citizens United. I think that we should support DC statehood at the same time. But look, I think another question, ranked choice voting, by the way, 100% on board with ranked choice voting and lowering the voting age to 16. I mean, I think these are all things that we need to do to protect our democracy and ensure that everyone has a voice. But the last point that I just want to make quickly, Jack, is I think we need to ask ourselves why. Why is the other side so afraid of what happens when Americans can vote? And I think the answer there is pretty clear. It's because they know they can't win these arguments. We brought it up just a moment ago. What exactly is the Republican plan on healthcare? What exactly is the Republican plan on the climate crisis? What exactly is the Republican plan on gun violence? And the answer is they don't have them. They don't exist. It's just to say that these things aren't happening and move on. And so I think that it's a real lesson. It's a lesson about the fact that the majority of Americans agree with us. We win these arguments when we make them, but we have to make sure that everyone can participate and have a voice in those conversations and in those elections.
Well, there's no doubt that the Republican systematic effort to gut voting rights and suppress the vote in communities of color has been racist and unconstitutional, and we have to continue fighting this everywhere that we see it, and need nonpartisan, independent redistricting commissions drawing our district lines. There are just also the principles of increasing access to voting and voting reforms that I think are incredibly important, especially in the time that we're in. Vote by mail is a particular example and something that we've really been advocating for. And in the particular crisis and times that we're in, we are it's so important that we get people to be able to participate in our democratic process and to be able to move forward with it safely and healthfully. So I think that investing federal resources in vote by mail and in election security, which clearly our president is sort of trying to undermine as we speak, we've got to be on top of that and fighting for that. We have to do it quickly because these elections are coming before we realize that it's going to be our primary in September and then the general election in November. So we have to stay on this and do it now.
Yeah, so it's interesting because like District 4, you see this massive division in voter turnout. You have a massive division in voter voice, and it's entirely along economic lines. So if you look at Dover, if you look at Brookline, Newton, the turnout for elections is enormous. If you look at Fall River, where there's a 20% poverty rate during good years, much less the 45% I think that they have now, and also the 30% high school dropout rates. And the turnout is terrible. And so we need to change our system so that those who are in the greatest pain are also closest to the power, as I mentioned, and that they can actually express their voice. So I'm excited about the vote by mail. system that looks like Massachusetts is going to be rolling out. It's shown to have up to from 30 to 60% turnout for votes, which is phenomenal. And I think, frankly, this is just one small conversation to have of a larger entire election reform process that includes ranked choice voting and ensuring that when we vote for a president, that the majority actually wins. We'd be in a very different place if that wasn't the case today.
I think there's a lot we can do. I think we need ranked choice voting. We also need to make sure we elect people who are not, selling our voices and our vote to the corporate lobby and the corporate PACs. And that means we need to make sure we expand the electorate. We need to make sure we have information security in the technology and build technology for 21st century voting process. We need to, I really like the Elizabeth Warren proposal for voter security and for getting rid of this voter suppression. And I want to make sure that we all understand here that voter suppression is not a partisan issue. Voter suppression happens both in the Democratic and in the Republican parties, and it's up to us to really stand up to make sure that communities who have been intentionally targeted to not be included and to be suppressed, that we actually reach out to them and build ties with them.